Before I go back to the desk, let's talk about Pete Hegseth. Pete has been accused of following in the footsteps of Bill Cosby, putting something in a woman's drink and then having his way with her. While Pete was never criminally charged or the subject of a civil suit, the woman involved did enter into a non-disclosure agreement with him, presumably after negotiating a nice piece of change. Sounds like the two of them decided the best course of action was to cover up the rape and move on with their lives. Wonder how the money was accounted for on their respective tax returns. Now, we're only talking about Pete because Trump has nominated him to be his Secretary of Defense. While the president does get to pick the members of his cabinet, it's only with the advice and consent of the Senate. Should the Senate consent to Pete and confirm him as Secretary of Defense? This raises the question, what standard does a nominee have to meet to receive the required consent? Some like to say the president, having been elected, is entitled to his choices, but that would render consent superfluous, making the Constitution's framers look silly for having given the Senate a confirmation role in the first place. So again, what is the standard? It's not in the Constitution. Therefore, it's left to common sense. Common sense would say the nominee should be qualified to perform the job. How qualified? Is barely qualified enough? Common sense would say highly qualified. And common sense would add that the person also should be moral. How moral? Is barely moral good enough? Common sense would say highly moral is more like it. Are there any previous cases similar to Pete's? In fact, there is one. John Tower was a longtime senator. George H.W. Bush nominated him to be Secretary of Defense, the very same position Trump wants Pete to hold. The Senate rejected Tower because he was thought to be a drunken womanizer, though, unlike Pete, Tower was never credibly accused of getting a woman drunk and then raping her. Wait a second, you say. Doesn't the Senate have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Pete is a rapist before it rejects him? No, because this isn't a criminal trial or proceeding. The Senate doesn't even have to believe he's a rapist by a preponderance of the evidence, because this isn't a civil proceeding either. This will be a confirmation hearing for an important government position. So it's really just a job interview governed by common sense. And common sense would not hire anyone to be Secretary of Defense, whereas here there is substantial evidence that the person is a rapist. Pete Hegseth isn't moral, not even barely moral. He's just a Bill Cosby wannabe who should be rejected. Reject Pete Hegseth.